What would you do if the world you knew turned its back on you, leaving you with nothing but a key to a place no one had seen in 20 years? For 19-year-old Iris Calloway, banished from the only home she'd ever known, that question was no idle speculation. She was handed a single, rust-pitted key and a deed to a forgotten safe house her father had owned, a place the town of Marlow Springs considered little more than a pile of rot at the edge of the woods. But the truth, waiting in the dust and shadows of that derelict cabin, was a secret legacy, a treasure that would not only save her from ruin, but rewrite the story of the town that cast her out. Settle in and stay close, and let the quiet strength of this story find you. We'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. The dust of the road from Marlow Springs clung to the hem of Iris Calloway's dress like a second skin, a gritty reminder of the place that no longer wanted her. She walked with a steady, determined pace, her gaze fixed on the line where the tidy, fenced-in world of the town gave way to the tangled, sovereign woods. Behind her, the windows of Marlow Springs were like 100 accusing eyes, their glass glinting in the late afternoon sun. They had judged her for a crime she did not commit, for a quiet love they deemed unseemly, and the verdict was exile. Her mother had wept behind a lace handkerchief, while her stepfather, a man of rigid pews and even more rigid principles, had pronounced the sentence. She was a stain upon the family's good name, a whisper in the churchyard. He'd pressed the cold iron key into her palm, his voice devoid of all warmth. "Your father left this. It's more than you deserve. Do not show your face here again." Iris clutched the key in her pocket, its teeth biting into her flesh. That was all she had of him now. Her father, a man the town remembered as a quiet failure, a dreamer who spent more time staring at weeds than tending to his accounts, had been gone 10 years. He died of a fever that swept through the valley, leaving behind only the faintest scent of pipe tobacco and damp earth on his old coat. And this one, forgotten property, the safe house. The name itself was a bitter irony. She felt anything but safe. She felt scoured raw, hollowed out by grief and injustice. Her only companion was the silence that walked beside her, a silence filled with the phantom echoes of her father's gentle voice and the sharp, final click of her family's front door. The road narrowed, becoming a path choked with brambles and shadowed by the looming pines of the whisperwood. The air grew cooler, smelling of moss and decay, and a profound, ancient loneliness that seemed to rise from the soil itself to meet her own. She was walking away from everything she knew, toward a ruin she was supposed to call home. But Iris Calloway was her father's daughter. She did not know how to surrender. She only knew how to put one foot in front of the other, her chin held high against the biting wind, and walk toward the life that was left to her. The safe house was less a house and more a suggestion of one. It slumped against the hillside as if the forest were slowly reclaiming it, board by weary board. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken back, and the porch listed to one side, its planks warped and green with moss. A single stone chimney, choked with ivy, stood as a lonely monument to fires long since extinguished. Shutters, stripped of their paint by years of sun and snow, hung from single hinges, banging a mournful, irregular rhythm in the breeze. This was not a shelter. It was a ghost. Iris stood before it, the key feeling impossibly small in her hand, the weight of her stepfather's dismissal settling upon her. This was her inheritance. This was her ruin, made manifest in splintered wood and broken glass. The townspeople were right. It was a worthless, forgotten place, a fitting home for a worthless, forgotten girl. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of rot and wet leaves filling her lungs. For a moment, her resolve faltered. The thought of turning back, of begging for a place as a scullery maid, of swallowing her pride for a warm corner in a barn, was a tempting whisper. But then her eyes fell upon something resting on the edge of the porch railing, half hidden by a tangle of dead morning glory vines. It was an old whittling knife. The wooden handle was worn smooth, shaped by the grip of a familiar hand. The blade was tarnished, but straight. It was her father's. He had always carried it, his thumb stroking the worn wood as he thought. his hands always busy carving some small creature from a scrap of pine. A bird, a fox, a sleeping cat. He had left it here. It was as if he were waiting for her. A current of strength, small but potent, moved through her. This place was not just an ending, it was a beginning. It was the last piece of him left on this earth, and she would not abandon it. She walked up the groaning steps, her boots sinking slightly into the soft wood, and slid the key into the lock. The mechanism resisted, screaming with rust, but with a final, desperate turn, the bolt scraped back. The door swung inward on a long, low groan, opening into a darkness that smelled of dust, mice, and the deep, unshakable sleep of time itself. She stepped across the threshold, leaving the world that had rejected her behind, and entered the quiet, waiting heart of her father's solitude. What secrets could be hiding in a place so thoroughly abandoned? Was this derelict cabin a final testament to her father's failure? Or was it a vessel for a truth no one in Marlow Springs had ever understood? Let us know in the comments what you think Iris will find inside. Be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage and hidden strength. Now, let's return to Iris, as she faces the judgment of the town one last time. A week of hard labor had made the cabin habitable, but her supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. With a heavy heart, Iris knew she had to face Marlow Springs. She tied her hair back with a piece of twine, straightened the shoulders of her worn dress, and walked the long road back into town, her father's whittling knife tucked securely in her pocket. The moment she stepped onto the main street, a chill descended that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Conversations ceased. Heads turned. The townspeople of Marlow Springs, paragons of Christian charity, stared at her, as if she were a wraith returned to haunt them. Whispers followed her, like burrs on a blanket. "There she is," a woman muttered behind her hand. "Living in that shack like an animal." "Shameless," another added. Iris kept her eyes forward, her face a mask of calm she did not feel, her steps even, and measured toward Abernathy's mercantile. As she reached for the door, a voice, loud and contemptuous, stopped her. "Well, look what the woods dragged in, the fallen dove of Marlow Springs." It was Jedediah Finch, his face flushed with self-importance. He was the son of the town elder, a man who had once tried to court her with clumsy poetry and sweaty palms, and who now took her downfall as a personal victory. He blocked her path, a cruel smirk on his lips. "I hear you're living in that old Callaway ruin. Fitting. A broken girl for a broken house. Tell me, are the rats good company?" Iris said nothing. She simply looked at him, her silence a more powerful rebuke than any words she could have summoned. His smirk faltered for a second, before he puffed out his chest. "Don't come crawling back when winter freezes you out. You made your bed of sin, now lie in it." He spat on the ground near her feet and strode away, the whispers of the onlookers swelling in his wake. Iris pushed open the door to the mercantile, the bell announcing her arrival, with a cheerful jingle that felt like a lie. Mr. Abernathy, a kind man with sad eyes, who had been her father's only friend, simply nodded at her list. As he gathered her meager supplies, flour, salt, beans, kerosene, an old woman stepped out from the shadows near the back of the store. It was Maud, a woman who lived alone on the edge of the woods, and was regarded by the town as half-wild herself. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes as dark and knowing as the forest floor. She placed a gnarled hand on Iris's arm. Her touch was surprisingly gentle. "Don't you mind them," she rasped, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Some roots grow best in the dark, child. Don't be afraid of the soil." The words made no sense, but the sincerity in the old woman's eyes was a balm. Mr. Abernathy slid a small bag of dried apples across the counter toward her. "On the house," he murmured, refusing to meet her gaze. "For your father's sake." Iris nodded her thanks, her throat too tight to speak. She gathered her things and walked back out into the hostile street, the cryptic words of the old woman echoing in her mind, a strange and fragile seed of hope planted in the barren ground of her despair. The journey back to the cabin felt longer this time, the weight of her supplies matched only by the weight of the town's scorn. The sun was setting as she reached the edge of the woods, casting long, skeletal shadows across the path. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches reaching like grasping arms. For the first time, a genuine fear took hold. Jedediah's words echoed in her ears. When winter freezes you out, the cabin, when it came into view, looked even more desolate in the fading light. It was one thing to claim it in the defiant light of day. It was another to face it in the encroaching dark, with the memory of a town's collective hatred still fresh. The wind picked up, moaning through the pines and rattling the loose shutter against the wall. It sounded like a lonely, grieving voice. Iris pushed the door open and stepped inside. The familiar scent of dust and old wood, a scant comfort. She lit a single lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows, but also making them deeper and more menacing in the corners of the room. She unpacked her supplies, her movements slow and deliberate, arranging the flour and beans on the rough-hewn shelf that served as her pantry. The silence of the cabin was immense. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was a hungry, waiting silence, filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and the long, slow decay of memory. She sat at the small table her father had built, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of cool water. The chill of the floorboards seeped through the soles of her boots. This was her life now. This cold, empty room. This profound and crushing solitude. She had been so determined, so sure she could make a life here. But now, with the night pressing in, her bravery felt like a fool's errand. She thought of her warm bed back home, the scent of her mother's baking, the low murmur of conversation after supper. A lump formed in her throat, thick and painful. She pulled her father's whittling knife from her pocket, its familiar weight a small anchor in the churning sea of her emotions. She ran her thumb over the smooth, worn handle. He had sat in this very room, perhaps at this very table. Had he felt this same loneliness? Had the silence pressed in on him, too? That night, sleep would not come. She lay on her simple cot, a thin blanket pulled up to her chin, and listened to the symphony of the old house. Every creak of the floorboards, every skittering sound in the walls, every sigh of the wind in the chimney, was magnified in the darkness. It was the sound of a place surrendering to time, and she felt herself surrendering with it. The house was settling, sinking back into the earth, and she feared she was too. The disappointment was a physical ache in her chest. The reality of her situation was far harsher than her defiant pride had allowed her to admit. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a tomb, and it was threatening to bury her alive. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to retreat into the darkness within, a darkness that matched the one that surrounded her completely. The cold was more than just the absence of heat, it was the absence of hope. Days turned into a week, then two. Iris fell into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the crumbling cabin. She worked from dawn until dusk, her body aching with a fatigue so deep it felt elemental. She learned the language of the house, the groan of a floorboard that meant a shift in the wind, the particular patter on the roof that warned of a coming downpour. She chinked the walls with mud and moss, her fingers raw and caked with dirt. She patched the worst of the holes in the roof with shingles she fashioned from fallen birch bark. She cleared the overgrown yard, uncovering a set of stone steps that led nowhere and a forgotten well that was, mercifully, still drawing clean, cold water. The labor was punishing, but it was honest. It kept the despair at bay, replacing it with the simple, satisfying exhaustion of a day's hard work. In the evenings, by the light of the kerosene lamp, she would hold her father's knife, not carving, just feeling the connection to him, her silent companion in the vast stillness. It was during one of these quiet evenings, while cleaning the soot from the main ceiling beam above the hearth, that she first noticed it. She had scrubbed the beam before, but the lantern light, held at a different angle, revealed something new. Faint lines, almost invisible beneath the layers of grime and smoke, were etched into the dark wood. They weren't carpenter's marks, or the random scratches of time. They were deliberate. There was a pattern to them, a series of geometric shapes and arrows that seemed to flow from the stone of the hearth, upward and across the ceiling. Her heart gave a small, curious flutter. She spent the next day meticulously cleaning the entire length of the beam. As more of the markings were revealed, a strange map unfolded above her. It wasn't a map of a river or a trail, but a diagram of the house itself, rendered in miniature. The hearth was clearly marked, as were the four walls of the cabin, but one set of lines pointed insistently to a specific spot in the ceiling. A spot where a faint, rectangular outline was just barely visible beneath the planking. The attic hatch. It was nailed shut with heavy, rusted spikes. Why would her father draw a map that pointed to a sealed attic? She ran her fingers over the strange, carved symbols. They felt ancient, full of a meaning she couldn't yet grasp. She didn't act on it immediately. She let the mystery settle, a quiet question mark, hanging in the air of the small cabin. The house had a secret, and it was waiting, patiently, right above her head. The physical labor of restoring the cabin became a form of conversation with her father. Every nail she straightened and hammered back into place, every patch she applied to the leaking roof, felt like answering a question he had posed long ago. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to embroidery, were now calloused and strong. They learned the grain of the wood, the heft of the axe, the particular way the morning light fell across the floorboards. She felt her father's presence, not as a ghost, but as a guiding principle in the logic of the construction, in the simple, sturdy way he had built things to last. The whittling knife was never far from her side. She used it to cut strips of leather for hinges, to scrape moss from the well stones, and in the quiet evenings, she began to carve. Small, simple shapes at first, a leaf, a feather. Then, she grew bolder, trying to replicate the animals her father had carved, her hands slowly learning the memory of his. The silence of the cabin was no longer menacing. It was companionable. It was a space to think. Her mind kept returning to the markings on the beam. The arrow pointing to the attic hatch was an insistent, silent command. The town saw this place as a symbol of his failure, a ramshackle hut built by a man who couldn't cope with the real world. But the markings suggested something else. They suggested purpose, design, a hidden layer of intent. Jedediah Finch's mocking voice echoed in her memory. A broken girl for a broken house. She looked at her hands, strong and capable. She looked at the cabin, slowly coming back to life under her care. They were not broken. They were surviving. She decided it was time. She dragged the heavy table beneath the hatch and climbed onto it, her lantern held high. The nails were driven deep into the wood, their heads rusted fast. It would take more than just pulling to open it. She retrieved the small pry bar from the lean-to and, bracing herself, wedged it under the edge of the hatch. The wood groaned in protest. For a long moment, nothing happened. She put all of her weight into it, her muscles straining. With a sudden, violent crack, one of the nails gave way, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. Heartened, she worked on the next, and then the next, until with a final, splintering wrench, the hatch swung downward, on protesting leather hinges, releasing a cascade of dust and the scent of ages. It was the smell of dry paper, of forgotten herbs, of time itself held captive. She held her lantern up to the dark, square opening, her heart pounding, with a mixture of fear and a thrilling, undeniable hope. The house was finally ready to tell its secret. The air that billowed down from the attic was thick and still, carrying a scent she couldn't quite place, a complex perfume of dried lavender, old paper, rich soil, and something else, something wild and green. It was her father's smell, distilled by time. Taking a steadying breath, Iris pulled herself up into the small, cramped space. The roof sloped sharply, forcing her to her knees. Dust motes danced like fairies in the single beam of her lantern light, illuminating a world sealed away for 2 decades. The space was surprisingly orderly. Against the far wall, a series of small, stout wooden chests were lined up, each one bound with leather straps. There were bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. their leaves brittle and fragrant. Stacked neatly beside the chests were dozens of leather-bound notebooks, their covers filmed with a fine layer of dust. This was not the forgotten attic of a failed man. This was a laboratory, a library, a vault. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the nearest chest. The leather straps were stiff, but they unbuckled with a soft crackle. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled in beds of raw cotton, were not coins or jewels, but hundreds of small, meticulously crafted paper packets. She picked one up. On the front, in her father's precise, elegant script, was a name, Starlight Tomato, and below it, a detailed drawing of a small, dark purple tomato, speckled with what looked like tiny yellow stars. She opened the packet. Inside were seeds, no bigger than a pinhead, perfect and dormant. She moved to the next chest, and the next. Each was the same. Packets of seeds, each with a unique, fantastical name. Sun-kissed corn, midnight bean, whispering grass, frostfire pepper. There were vegetables, grains, and flowers she had never seen or heard of, each one illustrated with breathtaking detail. She turned to the notebooks. She opened the first one. It was a journal, a record of his life's true work. Her father, Thomas Calloway, the man Marlowe Springs had dismissed as a shiftless dreamer, was a self-taught botanist, a visionary horticulturalist. The journals were filled with his observations on the native plants of the valley, his experiments with cross-pollination, his patient, decade-long effort to cultivate new species, plants that were not only beautiful and delicious, but also uniquely adapted to the region's harsh soil and unpredictable frosts. He had created strains that could resist blight, that needed less water, that could thrive where nothing else would grow. This was his safe house. It wasn't a place to hide from the world, but a place to protect his work, his legacy, his dream of a future where no one in the valley would ever go hungry. Tears streamed down Iris's face, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow, but of profound, aching pride. The treasure in the attic wasn't gold, it was life. It was a garden waiting to be born, a future for the very town that had scorned him, and he had left it all to her. That autumn, the sky turned a hard, unforgiving gray, and a cold descended that felt personal, a malice aimed directly at the valley. The first snow came not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, violent blizzard, a white curtain that dropped from the heavens and erased the world. The wind howled around the small cabin, a hungry animal trying to find a way in. Iris, who had spent the past weeks poring over her father's journals, was prepared as best she could be. She had reinforced the windows and laid in a good supply of firewood, but the storm was worse than anything she could have imagined. For 3 days, it raged without cease, piling drifts of snow against the door and windows, isolating her completely. On the 4th day, through a small patch she kept scraped clear on the window pane, she saw them, a man half frozen, stumbling through the deep snow, supporting a woman who was clearly in the last stages of pregnancy. Behind them, a small child struggled to keep up. Without a second thought, Iris threw her weight against the snow-blocked door, finally forcing it open enough to call out to them. They were travelers, their wagon having lost a wheel and been swallowed by the drifts a mile down the road. Their names were Samuel and Mary, their son David. They were chilled to the bone, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. She brought them inside, settled them by the fire, and gave them the last of her stew. The cabin was small, but the warmth of the hearth made it a haven. The storm, however, did not relent. Her firewood supply, meant for one, was dwindling at an alarming rate. By the second night of their stay, the woodpile was nearly gone. Samuel, his face grim, looked at the sturdy furniture her father had built. "We'll have to start burning the chairs," he said, his voice heavy with apology. Iris looked at the chairs, the table, the bed frame, but then her eyes went to the attic chests, filled with her father's life's work. They were made of dry, seasoned pine. They would burn hot and long. A terrible choice presented itself. Save the people who had stumbled into her care, or save the legacy she had just discovered. She saw the fear in Mary's eyes as she clutched her belly, felt the shiver of the small boy huddled under a blanket. She thought of her father's dream, a future where no one went hungry. What was the point of saving the seeds if she let the people they were meant to feed perish on her doorstep? But to burn the notebooks, to destroy the culmination of his genius, felt like a second death. In the end, the choice was clear. She would not burn the seeds. She would not burn the journals. That was the heart of the legacy. The chests, however, were just vessels. That night, she and Samuel broke apart the first empty seed chest. It felt like a desecration, but as the flames leaped high in the hearth, warming the small child and the expectant mother, she knew it was the right choice. She was not just the keeper of her father's dream. She was its first practitioner, choosing life, choosing community, even at a great personal cost. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was a pristine, silent expanse of white. Samuel, immensely grateful, fashioned a pair of crude snowshoes and made his way into Marlow Springs for help. The story he told was not the one the town expected to hear. He spoke not of a shameless, fallen girl living in squalor, but of a resourceful and compassionate young woman who had saved his family from freezing to death, sharing her last morsel of food and sacrificing her own possessions for their warmth. He told them how she had used her knowledge of herbs, learned from old books in the attic, to brew a tea that had broken his son's fever. The townspeople listened, their expressions shifting from skepticism to grudging respect. The narrative they had built around Iris Calloway began to crack. When spring finally came, melting the snow and revealing the wounded earth, the true miracle began. Iris, guided by her father's meticulous notes, prepared a small plot of land behind the cabin. She chose the hardiest seeds, the ones her father had marked as his greatest successes. She planted them with a reverence that was akin to prayer. The results were astonishing. The garden that grew in that small clearing was unlike anything the valley had ever seen. The corn grew twice as tall as any other, its ears heavy and sweet. The starlight tomatoes were a revelation, their flavor deep and complex. The plants were vibrant, lush, and untouched by the late frost that nipped at the crops in the town's own fields. Word of the Calloway garden spread. People began to make the trip out to the edge of the woods, not to mock, but to stare in wonder. One day, a buggy arrived, carrying a well-dressed man from a university in the east. He was a professor of botany, a man who had briefly corresponded with Thomas Calloway years ago and had been trying to track down his rumored work ever since. Iris showed him the notebooks and the seeds. The professor's eyes widened, his voice trembling with excitement, as he examined the detailed drawings and genetic notations. "My dear girl," he said, his voice full of awe, "do you know what this is? This is revolutionary. Your father, he was a genius. These varieties are priceless. They could change agriculture in this entire territory." The vindication was quiet, but absolute. Jedediah Finch, his own crops blighted and thin, came to her cabin, his hat in his hands, his arrogance replaced by a humbled desperation. He asked to buy some of her seed. Iris looked at him, the man who had reveled in her humiliation. She saw not an enemy, but just another person struggling against the harshness of the land. "I won't sell them to you," she said, her voice even, "but I will give them to you. In exchange, you will lead a party of men to help me rebuild the town's failing well." He agreed, his eyes full of a respect he had never shown anyone. The community, which had cast her out, was now beginning to turn to her for its salvation. The late afternoon sun cast a honeyed glow over the valley, illuminating the small cabin and the riot of life that surrounded it. The garden had become a pilgrimage site, a place of learning and of hope. On this particular evening, the air was filled with the low hum of conversation and the laughter of children. The people of Marlow Springs were here, not as spectators, but as participants. They worked alongside Iris, tending the rows, harvesting the strange and wonderful vegetables, their faces smudged with the rich soil her father had so loved. The rescued stranger, Samuel, had stayed, his family now living in a small homestead nearby. and he was helping her construct a small greenhouse from salvaged windows. Mr. Abernathy stood near the porch, watching the scene, a rare, gentle smile on his face. He caught Iris's eye and nodded toward the flourishing garden, the repaired cabin, the circle of neighbors working together. "Your father would be proud, Iris," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He always saw what this valley could be." Iris walked to the edge of the garden, to a patch of delicate, trumpet-shaped flowers that bloomed in a shade of blue, so deep it seemed to hold the twilight within its petals. It was a flower her father had created, one he had named Evening Serenity. She reached out and gently touched a velvety petal, the life in it thrumming against her fingertip. She thought of the cold quay, the derelict shack, the town's scorn. She thought of her father, the quiet man with dirt under his fingernails, and dreams of a better world in his heart. They had all misunderstood. They thought this place was an escape, a retreat from a world that didn't value him. But they were wrong. She looked out at the faces of her neighbors, their hands full of the bounty her father had imagined, and the quiet truth of his life settled over her with the warmth of the setting sun. He wasn't building a safe house, she murmured to the flower, to the evening, to the spirit of the man who had given her everything. He was planting a future. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet resilience. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest legacies are often found in the things the world has forgotten. If this story touched your heart, we'd be so grateful if you'd leave a like and a comment, and subscribe for more tales of hidden strength and unexpected grace. We have another story waiting for you, about a lonely lighthouse keeper and the mysterious message he finds in a bottle, washed ashore after a storm. We'll see you then.